There is a version of you that almost no one remembers, maybe even you. A version that existed before you learned which emotions made people uncomfortable, before you understood that honesty could create distance, before you discovered that being easy to love often meant becoming difficult to recognize. That version of you was louder, more curious, more sensitive, more demanding, more alive, but at some point, you began receiving instructions, not always through words, sometimes through silence. A parent withdrew when you became angry. A teacher embarrassed you for asking too many questions. A friend laughed when you revealed what mattered to you. Someone you loved became colder whenever you needed too much. And slowly, you learned not who you were, but who you were allowed to be. You learned which parts of yourself created approval and which parts created rejection. You learn to read the room before you read your own emotions. You learn to smile while uncomfortable, to agree while resentful, to appear calm while something inside you was screaming. And because these changes helped you remain connected to other people, they did not feel like self-betrayal. They felt like maturity. You called it becoming polite, becoming reasonable, becoming less dramatic, becoming easier to deal with. But beneath every adjustment was a hidden exchange. You were trading pieces of yourself for belonging, and for a while, the trade seemed worth it. People liked you more when you asked for less. They praised your strength when you stopped showing pain. They called you mature when you learned to manage everyone else's emotions before your own. They called you kind when you became unable to say no. They admired how independent you were without asking what had taught you that needing anyone was dangerous. You became acceptable, but you also became divided. There was the person the world rewarded, and beneath that person, there was someone waiting to be remembered. From a Jungian perspective, this socially acceptable identity is connected to what Carl Jung called the persona. The persona is the psychological mask we develop to function within society. It is not automatically false. Every person needs one. You speak differently to your employer than you speak to your closest friend. You behave differently at a funeral than you do at a celebration. The ability to adapt is necessary. The danger begins when adaptation becomes disappearance, when the mask stops being something you wear and becomes the only face you are permitted to have. Then you no longer use the persona. The persona uses you. You begin building your entire life around maintaining an identity that once protected you. The agreeable person, the responsible child, the strong one, the intelligent one, the quiet one, the successful one, the person who never causes problems, the person who can handle everything alone. And because this identity earns approval, questioning it feels dangerous. You may not even realize that you are performing. You may simply feel tired, empty, disconnected. You may look at your own life and wonder why it feels as if someone else chose it. You may achieve something you worked toward for years and feel almost nothing. You may be surrounded by people who love you and still experience the strange loneliness of being loved for a version of yourself you created for them. This is one of the deepest forms of loneliness, not having no one around you, but having people around you who have never met you, and perhaps they never met you because you never felt safe enough to arrive. The first abandonment. Most people imagine self-abandonment as a conscious act. They imagine someone knowing what they want and deliberately choosing against it. But self-abandonment usually begins long before a child has the language to understand what is happening. A child is dependent. Connection is not simply pleasant to a child. It is survival. A child cannot easily think, "My parent is emotionally unavailable. My environment cannot tolerate my sensitivity. The adults around me are projecting their own unresolved pain onto me." the child's mind reaches a simpler and more painful conclusion. There must be something wrong with me. If your sadness repeatedly overwhelms the people around you, you may decide that sadness is dangerous. If your anger creates punishment, you may decide that anger makes you unlovable. If your excitement is mocked, you may begin reducing yourself before entering a room. If your needs are treated like burdens, you may become someone who has no visible needs at all. This is not weakness. It is intelligence adapted to an unsafe emotional environment. The child notices the conditions of belonging and reorganizes around them. I am loved when I succeed. I am safe when I stay quiet. I am accepted when I do not disagree. I am valuable when I help. I am good when I forgive quickly. I am wanted when I make other people comfortable. These beliefs may never be spoken aloud, but they become the architecture of a personality. You build yourself around the question, what version of me will prevent them from leaving? And when that question guides development, identity becomes secondary to attachment. You do not ask what you feel. You ask what feeling is permitted. You do not ask what you want. You ask what desire will create the least conflict. You do not ask who you are. You ask who the situation requires you to become. This is how the authentic self is pushed underground, not destroyed completely. Hidden, the traits that threaten belonging are forced outside the conscious identity. The anger, the ambition, the sexuality, the vulnerability, the selfishness, the creativity, the need for attention, the desire to be protected, the wish to say no, the wish to stop understanding everyone. These qualities do not vanish simply because they are rejected. They move into what Jung called the shadow. The shadow contains the aspects of the personality that the conscious identity refuses to recognize. People often hear the word shadow and imagine cruelty, violence, or evil, but the shadow is not only where we hide what is socially unacceptable, it is also where we hide what was unacceptable in our particular environment. For one person, aggression may enter the shadow; for another, tenderness; for one person, selfishness; for another, confidence. A child raised around fragile adults may hide strength because strength feels threatening. A child praised only for achievement may hide playfulness because play feels useless. A child forced to become responsible too early may hide dependency because needing care feels shameful. The shadow, therefore, contains not only your darkness, it contains your unlived life, the person you could have become if belonging had not required your fragmentation. And although that person is hidden, it does not remain silent. It appears in the people you envy, in the emotions you judge, in the lives that secretly fascinate you, in the moments when someone says no without explaining themselves, and something inside you becomes angry. Perhaps you call them selfish, but maybe what disturbs you is their freedom. You watch someone speak openly, take up space, leave an unhealthy relationship, change careers, disappoint their family, or choose themselves. You criticize them, yet beneath the criticism, there may be grief. They are expressing a permission you never received. They are living through a part of you that had to be buried. The person everyone likes. There is often a cruel irony in becoming acceptable. The more successful the persona becomes, the harder it is to question. Perhaps everyone describes you as kind, reliable, calm, patient, understanding. You are the person people call when their lives collapse. You listen, you reassure them, you absorb their fear, you find the right words. You make them feel seen, but when the conversation ends, no one asks what you are carrying, and even if they did, you might not know how to answer, because being the strong one was never just something you did. It became your claim to belonging. If you stop being useful, who will stay? If you express anger, will they still call you kind? If you admit that you are exhausted, will they feel deceived? If you begin asking for the care you provide so naturally, will the relationship survive? This is why healing can initially feel like becoming a worse person. You may become less available, less agreeable, less predictable. You may stop replying immediately. You may refuse requests that you once accepted automatically. You may tell the truth and watch disappointment appear on someone's face. And because your nervous system associates approval with safety, every boundary can feel like an act of violence. You may feel guilty even when you have done nothing wrong. The guilt does not necessarily mean the boundary is wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional cost of breaking an old survival rule. The rule said, keep everyone comfortable. The boundary says, my comfort also matters. The rule said, never become difficult. The boundary says, I am allowed to have limits. The rule said, love must be earned. The boundary says, love that requires my disappearance is not love. At first, these new beliefs may feel unnatural. Of course they do. You have rehearsed the opposite for years. The persona has had more practice than the self. But practice is not truth. Familiarity is not identity. And survival is not the same thing as living. The life built around acceptance may keep you connected to everyone except yourself. And eventually the abandoned self begins demanding your attention. Not always gently. Sometimes it arrives as depression, as resentment, as anxiety without an obvious cause, as emotional numbness, as fantasies of leaving your entire life behind, as sudden rage over small events, as exhaustion that sleep does not repair, as the quiet realization that you no longer know what you enjoy when no one is watching. These experiences are often treated only as problems to eliminate, but sometimes the symptom is also a message. Something inside you is refusing to continue the performance. The personality you built to survive has reached its limit, and the version of you that was forced underground is no longer willing to remain buried. The addiction to approval. If you wear a mask long enough, something strange begins to happen. You stop asking whether people love you. Instead, you begin asking whether they approve of you. At first, those two questions seem identical, but they are not. Approval depends on performance. Love survives honesty. Approval asks, how useful are you? Love asks, who are you? Approval can disappear the moment you disappoint someone. Love makes room for disappointment without demanding your disappearance. The tragedy is that many people never experience the difference. They become experts at earning approval while remaining strangers to genuine intimacy. Because approval feels familiar, predictable, safe. It follows rules: work harder, smile more, need less, achieve more, never become inconvenient, never become emotional, never become complicated. And every time those rules produce affection, the nervous system learns another lesson. I have to earn my place. The danger is that what begins as adaptation slowly becomes addiction, not because praise is evil, but because your identity begins depending on it. Imagine standing in front of a mirror that only reflects you when someone else is looking. Eventually, you forget what your own face looks like. This is what chronic approval seeking does to identity. You begin seeing yourself through borrowed eyes. You measure your value through reactions. You feel attractive only when desired, intelligent only when admired, successful only when envied, important only when needed. Without realizing it, your emotional center has moved outside yourself. Your worth now lives in other people's opinions, and anything that lives outside you can always be taken away. This is why criticism can feel unbearable, not because someone disagreed, but because criticism threatens the identity that keeps you psychologically alive. A single negative comment suddenly outweighs 100 compliments. One rejection erases years of achievement. One disappointed face can make you question your entire personality. To someone with a stable sense of self, Criticism is information. To someone whose identity depends on approval, criticism feels like annihilation. Carl Jung understood this dynamic long before modern psychology described external validation. He believed that whenever consciousness becomes identified with only one part of the personality, balance disappears. The stronger the persona becomes, the weaker the relationship with the authentic self. And nature always seeks balance. What consciousness refuses to acknowledge eventually returns through suffering. That suffering is not punishment, it is communication. The unconscious has no language, it speaks through symptoms. When the body begins speaking, people often believe emotional suppression stays inside the mind. It doesn't. The body remembers every emotion that consciousness refused to experience. Think about the last time you smiled while furious, or apologized when someone hurt you, or agreed to something you desperately wanted to refuse. Notice what happened. Perhaps your shoulders tightened, your jaw locked, your stomach became heavy, your breathing shortened, your heartbeat accelerated. Your body knew the truth long before your words admitted it. The body rarely lies. It simply speaks a language most people stopped listening to. Over months, over years, sometimes over decades, those ignored signals accumulate. Eventually they become exhaustion, chronic anxiety, emotional numbness, burnout, the strange feeling of waking up already tired, not because life is objectively impossible, but because maintaining a false identity consumes enormous psychological energy. Imagine acting in a play, not for 2 hours, not for one day. Imagine performing a role every waking moment for 20 years, never forgetting your lines, never breaking character, never allowing anyone backstage. Would you call yourself weak for becoming exhausted? Of course not. Performance is expensive, and many people have been performing since childhood. Their personality became a full-time occupation. They wake up asking, what version of me is required today? Instead of, what is actually true today? The difference seems small. It changes everything, because one question creates authenticity, the other creates survival, the invisible grief. There is a grief that almost no one talks about. Not the grief of losing another person, the grief of losing yourself. You cannot attend its funeral. No one sends flowers. No one tells you they are sorry, because no one saw the death happen. It happened quietly, one compromise at a time, one swallowed emotion, one abandoned dream, one forced smile, one acceptable version of yourself replacing another, until eventually you look back and cannot remember when you disappeared. Sometimes people call this a quarter-life crisis, sometimes a midlife crisis, sometimes burnout, sometimes depression, sometimes they suddenly quit their job, end a relationship, move across the country, change careers, shave their head, disappear for months. Friends say they've changed, but perhaps they haven't. Perhaps they have finally stopped pretending. The crisis was never becoming someone different. The crisis was realizing they had been someone different for years. That realization can be terrifying, because if your identity was built around pleasing others, who are you without their expectations? The answer does not arrive immediately, and that's where many people turn back, not because the old life was fulfilling, but because it was familiar. Human beings often choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar freedom. The known pain feels safer than the unknown possibility. Jung repeatedly warned that the path toward becoming oneself is not comfortable. He called it individuation, not self-improvement, not self-optimization, not becoming perfect, becoming whole. Wholeness is very different from perfection. Perfection removes everything unacceptable. Wholeness welcomes everything that is real. Your confidence, your fear, your generosity, your selfishness, your tenderness, your anger, your courage, your insecurity, your desire to connect, your desire to be alone. None of these make you broken. They make you human. The problem begins when consciousness decides only half of them deserve to exist. Everything else is pushed underground, and what is buried never stops growing. The return of the shadow. People imagine the shadow as something dark waiting to destroy them. Often, it arrives carrying exactly what they need. The woman who has spent her life pleasing everyone suddenly becomes furious over something insignificant. She believes she is becoming irrational. In reality, years of ignored anger have finally found a voice. The man who always appears strong suddenly breaks down while driving home from work. He thinks he is falling apart. Perhaps he is finally allowing himself to feel. Someone who has always chosen security suddenly becomes obsessed with traveling the world. Another suddenly wants to paint, write, dance, leave the corporate job, speak publicly, fall in love, live differently. These impulses often appear inconvenient, irresponsible, immature, but not every unexpected desire is an escape. Sometimes it is the return of a neglected part of the personality. The unconscious has extraordinary patience. It waits for decades if necessary. It whispers first, then nudges, then interrupts your sleep, then appears in dreams, then creates anxiety, then depression, then crises, not because it wishes to punish you, but because something inside refuses to let your life end without ever being lived. The shadow is not your enemy. Ignoring it is. The person who refuses to acknowledge anger eventually becomes passive-aggressive. The person who refuses ambition begins envying everyone who succeeds. The person who refuses vulnerability slowly loses the ability to love deeply. The person who refuses dependency becomes incapable of receiving care. Every rejected quality eventually finds another way to express itself. That is one of Jung's deepest observations. Nothing psychological simply disappears. It transforms, and the more energy required to suppress it, the more powerfully it eventually returns. Perhaps that is why your reactions sometimes surprise you, why you become disproportionately emotional over something small, why certain people instantly irritate you, why someone else's confidence feels offensive, why another person's freedom feels threatening. The unconscious is often pointing towards something consciousness abandoned long ago. When envy is not about them, there is an emotion most people are taught to hide as quickly as possible. Envy. We are told it is ugly, petty, immature, something decent people should never admit to feeling. So we push it away the moment it appears. We judge ourselves for it. We pretend it isn't there. But Jung believed that the emotions we reject often contain the information we need most, and envy is no exception. Imagine watching someone speak confidently in a room full of strangers. Something inside you tightens. You immediately think, they're arrogant. But are they? Or are they expressing a confidence you never believed you were allowed to have? Perhaps you see someone leave a relationship that no longer serves them. Instead of admiration, you feel irritation. You tell yourself they are selfish, but maybe what you actually feel is grief because they possessed a freedom you abandoned years ago. Envy is rarely about wanting another person's life. More often, it points toward the life your own personality never permitted itself to live. It is one of the ways the shadow calls your attention, not by saying, become them, but by asking, what part of yourself did you bury that you now recognize in them? This changes everything. Instead of treating envy as evidence that you are a bad person, you begin treating it as psychological information. Every person who strongly affects you becomes a mirror. Some reflect the parts of yourself you proudly identify with. Others reflect the parts you rejected long ago. Both are valuable because every intense emotional reaction says less about the other person than it does about your own unconscious. Projection, seeing yourself without knowing it. Projection is one of Jung's most influential ideas, and perhaps one of the most misunderstood. People often imagine projection as simply accusing someone else of what is true about yourself, but psychologically, projection is much deeper. Projection happens whenever consciousness cannot recognize something within itself. Instead of experiencing that quality internally, The mind experiences it externally. The quality seems to belong entirely to someone else. You believe another person is controlling, manipulative, weak, cold, needy, selfish, brilliant, perfect, without realizing that your perception is being shaped by unconscious material. Projection is not hallucination. The other person may genuinely possess those qualities, but the emotional intensity often comes from something inside you. Think about the people who occupy your mind far longer than they objectively should. The coworker you cannot stop thinking about, the stranger who irritated you all day, the relationship that ended years ago but still feels emotionally unfinished. Why them? Why not someone else? Because the unconscious chooses symbols carefully. Certain people become screens onto which we project forgotten parts of ourselves. Sometimes we project our wounds, sometimes our fears, sometimes our unlived potential, sometimes our ideal self. This is why falling in love can feel almost supernatural. In the beginning, you are often not seeing the person clearly. You are seeing your own unconscious reflected back at you. They appear impossibly complete, exceptionally wise, uniquely understanding. They seem like the missing piece of your identity. Then reality slowly interrupts the fantasy. They disappoint you. They reveal ordinary human flaws. The projection begins collapsing. People often call this heartbreak. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it is also the painful return of everything you unknowingly placed inside another human being. The same process happens outside romantic relationships. We idealize leaders, mentors, celebrities, friends, parents, even enemies. The stronger the emotional charge, the more carefully we should ask ourselves, what part of myself am I seeing through this person? That question is uncomfortable because it shifts responsibility. It no longer asks, who are they? It asks, what inside me gave them this power? The life that never happened. Imagine reaching 80 years old, not filled with regret over failure, filled with regret over possibility, not mourning what went wrong, mourning what never happened, the conversations you never started, the art you never created, the boundaries you never set, the cities you never explored, the love you never expressed, the dreams you quietly traded for predictability. This is one of the deepest fears hidden beneath the persona. Not that people will reject you, that you will never truly meet yourself. Because every year spent performing strengthens the illusion. You become increasingly skilled at living someone else's expectations. Eventually, people begin complimenting the performance. They say, "You're so dependable, so mature, so easy to work with, so calm, so selfless." Those compliments feel wonderful, but a quiet question sometimes appears afterward. If they knew the real me, would they still say those things? That question reveals something important. Somewhere inside, you already know the performance exists. You already know there is someone waiting behind it. The authentic self rarely disappears completely. It leaves clues. Notice what repeatedly pulls your attention. Notice what kind of books make you lose track of time. What conversations leave you energized instead of exhausted. Which people make you feel larger instead of smaller. Which environments allow your nervous system to relax. Which activities make hours disappear. Children naturally follow these signals. Adults often ignore them because practicality becomes more important than vitality. But vitality matters. Life is not measured only by achievement. It is measured by aliveness, and aliveness cannot be manufactured through approval. Individuation begins with disappointment. Many people imagine personal transformation as a moment of inspiration, a breakthrough, a motivational speech, a powerful realization. Real transformation is usually much quieter. It often begins with disappointment. Not disappointment in other people, disappointment in the life you've been performing. You wake up one morning. Nothing terrible has happened. Your job is stable. Your relationships seem normal. Your routine continues exactly as before. Yet something feels profoundly wrong. The old strategies stop working. People praise you. You feel empty. You achieve a goal. The satisfaction lasts one afternoon. You buy something new. The excitement disappears by the weekend. Approval no longer fills the space it once covered. This is not failure. It is evolution. The personality that once protected you has completed its task. It carried you through childhood, through adolescence, through difficult environments. It deserves gratitude, but it was never meant to become your permanent identity. Healing is not destroying the persona. It is putting it back in its proper place. A useful mask, not your entire face. Individuation begins the moment you become more interested in truth than approval, more interested in authenticity than admiration, more interested in reality than performance. That shift changes every relationship you have, including the relationship with yourself, because for the first time, you stop asking what will make them stay and begin asking what would make me feel alive. That question is frightening because the answer may change your life. It may require disappointing people who only loved your performance. It may require saying no, speaking honestly, leaving familiar environments, starting over, grieving old identities, walking away from roles that once defined you. But every meaningful transformation demands a death, not the death of who you are, the death of who you became in order to survive. And although every ending feels like loss, some endings are actually introductions. They introduce you to the person who has been patiently waiting beneath the mask all along. Meeting the stranger within. If you decide to stop living entirely through the persona, something unexpected happens. At first, you do not feel free, you feel confused. For years, perhaps decades, your identity has been built around a simple question: what do they need me to be? Now that question no longer guides your decisions. So another question appears: who am I when no one is watching? It sounds simple. For many people, it is one of the hardest questions they will ever ask. Because authenticity is not a personality trait waiting to be discovered. It is something uncovered, like an ancient statue buried beneath layers of dust. The sculptor does not create the figure. He removes everything that does not belong. Your task is remarkably similar, not becoming someone new, removing what was never truly you. The fear, of course, is that nothing meaningful will remain, but that fear belongs to the persona. The authentic self does not need to be invented. It has been waiting patiently, quietly, sometimes for decades. The courage to disappoint. There is a sentence that changes the course of many lives. Some people will be disappointed by the real you. Notice how different that is from saying, the real you is disappointing. Those are not the same sentence. If someone has only ever known the version of you that never says no, your boundaries may feel like rejection. If someone has benefited from your constant availability, your absence may feel like abandonment. If someone built their comfort around your silence, your honesty may sound like aggression. People often mistake change for betrayal, especially when your old personality made their life easier. This is why healing sometimes changes relationships, not because you stopped loving people, but because you stopped disappearing for them. Some relationships grow stronger, others quietly fall apart. That can be heartbreaking, but not every relationship is meant to survive your authenticity. Some relationships survive only because one person continually sacrifices themselves. That is not intimacy. That is an arrangement. Real intimacy requires two real people, not one real person and one performance. Integration. Jung did not believe psychological growth meant eliminating darkness. He believed it meant integrating it. Integration means recognizing that opposing qualities can exist together. You can be compassionate and capable of saying no, confident and uncertain, independent and willing to ask for help, strong, and deeply sensitive. The mature personality is not built through perfection. It is built through complexity. Children think in opposites, good or bad, strong or weak, loved or rejected. Adults gradually discover something deeper. Life rarely asks you to choose between opposites. It asks you to hold them together. That is psychological maturity. The goal is not becoming fearless. The goal is refusing to let fear choose your identity. The goal is not eliminating insecurity. The goal is preventing insecurity from becoming your author. The goal is not becoming someone everyone approves of. The goal is becoming someone you recognize, because eventually you will spend more time alone with yourself than with anyone else. Approval cannot comfort you there. Status cannot comfort you there. Performance cannot comfort you there. Only honesty can. Returning home. Perhaps healing is not about creating a better future. Perhaps it is also about recovering a forgotten past. The child who laughed too loudly, who asked impossible questions, who imagined strange futures, who cried openly, who became excited over insignificant things, who believed life could be larger than survival. That child was not naive. That child was unconsciously whole. Life demanded adaptation, and adaptation was necessary, but somewhere along the journey, adaptation became identity. Now the journey reverses, not backward into childhood, forward into wholeness. The child returns, not to replace the adult, but to complete them. The adult offers wisdom. The child offers vitality. The adult offers discipline. The child offers imagination. The adult offers responsibility. The child reminds you why responsibility mattered in the first place. Without both, life becomes either chaos or emotional imprisonment. Together, they become something far more beautiful, a human being who no longer needs to choose between acceptance and authenticity. One quiet question. Before this video ends, there is one question worth carrying with you, not to answer immediately. Some questions deserve time, some deserve silence. Ask yourself this: if nobody expected anything from me, who would I slowly become? Not tomorrow, not next year. Over time, what would you wear? How would you speak? Which relationships would remain? Which ambitions would finally matter? What would you create? What would you stop apologizing for? Who would you become if belonging no longer required pretending? Do not rush to answer. Simply notice what appears. The first response often comes from the persona. The quieter response usually comes from somewhere much deeper. Closing, Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." It is a beautiful sentence, but becoming who you truly are is not a single moment. It is 1,000 small decisions, choosing honesty over performance, presence over perfection, truth over approval, again and again and again. Some people will misunderstand you. Some will leave. Some will insist you have changed. Maybe you have, or maybe, for the first time, you have stopped pretending. The version of you that had to die to be accepted never truly disappeared. It has been waiting beneath every forced smile, every swallowed opinion, every abandoned dream, every moment you chose belonging over yourself, patiently, quietly, waiting for one decision, not the decision to become someone else, the decision to finally come home. If this video made you think differently about yourself, take a moment before moving on. Ask yourself one honest question: what part of me have I been asking to disappear, simply to make other people comfortable? You don't have to answer anyone else. Just don't spend another lifetime avoiding your own answer.